everyone, and welcome back to Immigration Insights, the podcast for the GT Business Immigration and Compliance Group at Greenberg Traurig. My name is Kate Kalmykov, and I co-chair the group. And today I am thrilled to have my good friend Jill Jones from JTC on the program to discuss fund administration. Hi, Jill. Thank you for joining us. If you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Kate, thanks so much for the invitation. I know your podcast has been around for a while, so I'm honored to be one of your guests. As Kate mentioned, my name is Jill Jones, and I am General Counsel and Head of Specialty Fund Administration at JTC. JTC is a company that is specializing in fund administration for all types of funds, but in 2020, they acquired NES Financial, which was uniquely specialized for EB-5 fund administration. So I've gotten the pleasure of working with Kate for a number of years, and I am thrilled to be here today to talk about the role of fund administration and how it's changed since the Reform and Integrity Act was enacted.
So let's dive right in. So the EB-5 program was introduced in 1990, the Regional Center program in 1992, and implemented in 1993. And there was no fund administration requirement this entire time. But many of us worked with you regardless, right? So
Right.
tell me a little bit about what you were doing before the change in the EB-5 law under the Reform and Integrity Act in 2022. Why were people using NES Financial, later JTC?
That's a great question. And, it goes back to kind of what our founders believed in. And that was really built around the idea that there are certain industries that have little to no regulation, but they involve holding money belonging to someone else. And so it was the idea that best practices should be implemented before there's legislative or regulatory matters in place. So NES believed that in EB-5, you have a number of foreign nationals who are hoping to come to the United States, and they're entrusting their savings, a big chunk of their savings, to people they really don't have a relationship with. These are regional centers and NCEs that are building projects here that are meant to create jobs for US citizens, but there was no opportunity most of the time to meet face to face and to get comfortable with where the money was going. And so really NES built a practice around how to get the money into the country safely, first off, and to provide some transparency and security so that these foreign nationals could keep track of where their money was and that it was being spent on the proper things.
And, you mentioned regional centers and new commercial enterprises. So those are the entities that have gotten the license from the immigration agency to collect immigrant investor funds for purposes of investment in the EB-5 program. But prior to 2022, prior to the Reform and Integrity Act, there was not really any kind of background checks done on them. When they were receiving the licensure, really the immigration agency was checking off the box that the immigration template met the regulations, that there was security documents in the package, but they weren't really delving into who's administering the project. Once the project receives the funds, what kind of oversight is there going to be? How are we going to ensure that the funds make it into the project, that they're not diverted, that they're not stolen, that things are being administered correctly? And I think that resulted in a lot of headlines in the news where unfortunately bad actors entered the space. They took advantage of many foreigners. And yes, there were failed projects for bona fide reasons. Any project can fail. It's a business investment. It's subject to business risks, delays in construction, inability to secure other financing. That's one thing. But there were a number of bad actors who absconded with funds, who committed malfeasance, who essentially disappeared with the money. And I think this became a subject of a lot of concern for Congress. And we got the Reform and Integrity Act in 2022. The program was suspended for 9 months while this was being debated. And the RIA, as we call it, was introduced with a lot of integrity measures. So now a project is required to work with either a fund administrator or get audited financials. They're required to submit annual compliance filings. They're subject to audits once every 5 years. They're subject to site visits. Their principals of the regional center of the project have to go through background checks. The agents that raise money for the project or the regional center likewise has to submit a filing so that they're on record with USCIS. That's a new innovation. So Jill, tell us a little bit about your role as a fund administrator after the RIA. Now, what are you doing that's different? Is it more robust? What services are you providing at JTC to clients?
Yeah, that's a really great point, Kate. So as you said, the RIA introduced a lot of new obligations and a lot of new costs. And to some people, that was very off-putting. It turned them to think badly of the program. But essentially, I think it's a good thing. And what it's done is to put a level of sophistication into the program. And what that does is it helps us get closer and closer to making the program permanent. One thing we haven't talked about is how many times the program has actually come up to a sunset date, whether it was renewed immediately or there were brief pauses. You mentioned this most recent one was a 9-month pause. And I think what Congress was looking at, and especially Senators Leahy and Grassley, they wanted to see the program get cleaned up, and they wanted to see the opportunities for fraud get cut off. And so that really made the role of the fund administrator very important. What the fund administrator is doing is it's layering in a second or third even set of eyes to make sure that the investor funds that are being brought into these offerings are being held, managed, and spent in the proper way. You mentioned a lot of fraud opportunities that came up, and they were really big in the news. And unfortunately, those are the kinds of stories that people grasp onto. Oftentimes, we overlook all of the good stories where we've created new jobs in areas that were depressed and had high unemployment rates. And we've created schools where schools were needed. But what the fund administrator is doing is making sure that not only are the funds being used properly, but the timing is correct. The worst thing you could have happen is that an NCE, a new commercial enterprise, is pushing all of the investor funds to the job creating enterprise too early. And that job creating enterprise is left with excess money and the temptation to maybe invest it to earn more or to do things with it before it's necessarily needed in the project. And that's where people got into trouble, is sometimes those were risky choices and then the money wasn't available at the right time. So one thing specifically that the RIA is requiring of the fund administrator is to be a co-signatory. And this was never a thing prior to the Reform and Integrity Act. Even fund administrators like myself that were in the business weren't taking that step. And what that's done is make sure that not only are the expenditures in accordance with a typical securities offering, but also that they're in accordance with immigration laws. And what that means is the money going to actual job creating activities? And does it match the applications that have been filed with USCIS? You know, it was also not required that projects file an exemplar petition, but now with the I-956Fs, that really is an exemplar. And all of the project specifics have to be submitted to USCIS and approved before a project is granted kind of the gold stamp of you can proceed. And so with the requirement that a fund administrator be a co-signatory, now they're looking at the PPMs, the private placement memorandums. They're looking at the business plans. They're looking at the economic reports, and they're making sure that the expenditures match all those documents. If that's not checked off, if that's not reviewed, there's a chance that investor money is spent on something else. And the result could be that their immigration petitions are denied. And depending where these people are at the time, if they're already in the United States, that could even roll into a deportation situation. And nobody wants to see that.
Yeah, I mean, it's always the investors here who, honestly are putting in the money, are staking their immigration on it. And we always need to keep in mind how important it is for them. and, how they need to be protected.
That's
Now,
right.
you brought up audits before, and a lot of clients sometimes ask, what's the difference if I do audited financials or I work with a fund administrator? What's the benefit of working with the fund administrator versus doing audited financials? Obviously, I think cost is one issue, but Jill, how do you usually respond to that question?
One of my favorite questions, actually. When you look at the difference between a fund administrator and an audit, at the end of the day, both have the same goal, which is to make sure that everything is done properly. The difference is a fund administrator is real time and ongoing interactive. So if something were to look like it was going awry, there would be an opportunity to correct it. An audit, on the other hand, is looking back over a year's worth of activity. If something were to come up at that point, it's too late to fix it. All you can do then is manage what you've got. One thing that I've noticed people don't speak a lot about, though, is if one were to choose the audit option, it is required that that audit be delivered to both USCIS and all of the investors in that NCE. And people aren't talking about what the risk of that might be. And as I said, if there is something that has gone wrong in that audit that's discovered, you're now announcing it to USCIS and the investors. So you're opening up the NCE to the possibility that there are denials, and you're opening up the investors to the possibility of lawsuits because they're not happy with what came out of the audit.
In addition to that, there's new provisions in the RIA that discuss debarment. So if there's any kind of malfeasance, if there's a diversion of funds that's unauthorized, that goes against what was presented to USCIS, they can terminate the regional center, they can terminate the project, and they can actually debar them from raising EB-5 money again. So there's also that consequence.
There sure is. And thankfully, the RIA did build in some innocent investor protections, but they only go so far. In theory, they're wonderful. And what they say is if your regional center is debarred, you have an opportunity to work with a different regional center. But at this point, I don't see a line of regional centers looking to take in abandoned investors, right? So the question then becomes, have the jobs been created? And has the money been held at risk for the appropriate amount of time? If the answers to those two questions are yes, chances are the investor doesn't have much to worry about. But if the jobs aren't created yet, and the NCE is now looking for a new regional center to sponsor them, would I be right to say that there's only a short amount of time, Kate? There's 180 days to find a new regional center?
Yes. So, and as far as I know, this hasn't even been used yet. There's a lot of misconceptions about debarment and what happens. And this is USCIS initiated. It's not even something that investors can initiate. So it's very trying for the investors because maybe they have aged out children, they're in a panic, and the USCIS, for those of us that deal with them on the regular, does not move that quickly, does not make decisions that quickly. And here they're the ones initiating, procedures, but the investors are the ones that, have suffered a loss.
That's right.
So you also talked about co-signing as a fund administrator. Can you talk a little bit about what that entails? Why is that important? And for how long does that last? So how long is this fund administrator relationship required by the statute? And how long is it in practice?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways to answer that question. What I'll start with is for the co-signatory, the RIA spells out that the new commercial enterprise must hold all EB-5 funds in a separate account. So it can't be commingled with any other operating expenses. That account would be used for all capital that is being raised to go into, and all disbursements from that NCE separate account go to the job creating enterprise account. Also, if the NCE and the JCE are affiliated, the JCE must also have a separate account for the EB-5 funds. That's good in one respect because it makes the bookkeeping very easy, very clean. We don't have to worry about the clouding of other monies coming and going and being able to segregate the EB-5 pieces. Nobody likes to be the guy that costs more money and somebody else is telling all of the participants they're required. But that is where the fund administrator sits today. And so one of the goals of JTC in the co-signatory in particular is to do a lot of the work up front. We review the documents and we create checklists. So the expectations of what's going to be required to make a disbursement are outlined ahead of time. So we're not a delay. And as far as the expense goes, we try to show what is our benefit. So when people are looking at what is the overall cost of putting together a project, adding in the fund administrator sometimes feels like it's unfair, but there are additional benefits. So when you look at having this co-signatory function, it's taking a headcount burden off of the new commercial enterprise or the regional center. So you're not having to double pay someone to review all of these documents and make sure that they're compliant. It bridges a gap where you may not need to rely on immigration counsel as much for disbursements because an experienced EB-5 fund administrator would know what kind of expenditures are proper versus not proper.
And what about the length of the relationship, right? Definitely the fund administrator is involved when the monies are being dispersed, as you said. But what about on return? How long does this relationship last?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to look at that one as well. We know that the fund administrator is required to keep all of the books, all of the records, and even communications for investors for the life of the investment. And so a lot of the heavy lifting is done on the capital raise and deployment phase. And then there's kind of a quiet time. And the fund administrator is still available at that time because USCIS is allowed to call for documents. Investors are going to be getting prepared to file their I-829 petitions and they will need documents. And we know that these once at least every 5-year audits are going to come up and the regional center will need access to documents during that period as well. So I would say at the very minimum, the fund administrator is involved until capital is returned or the fund is liquidated. There are also some clauses in the RIA that require a period of 5 years beyond the last transaction. And the definition of last transaction is a little bit fuzzy, but I would say at least 5 years beyond when the fund is liquidated is the more conservative approach. 5 years beyond the last disbursement of funds could be a little bit more aggressive, but still probably compliant.
Now, you brought up experienced fund administrator. And, EB-5, I think, is a very dynamic field. So we a lot of times have new service providers, new groups entering the space. And if a project or a regional center is looking to work with a fund administrator, what should they be looking for?
First and foremost, they should be looking for a fund administrator who understands the complexity of having securities law components layered in with immigration law components. Specific to EB-5 would be absolutely preferable because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, understanding when a disbursement or a deployment of funds is proper is different from the average securities offering to an EB-5 securities offering. There are limitations to what the money can be spent on. So one who's interviewing potential fund administrators might ask, how many projects have you worked on? And what were some of the most challenging situations you encountered as a fund administrator? Who else have you worked with regularly in terms of a team? Meaning which securities attorneys, which immigration attorneys? The partnership of all of the players and their experience in EB-5 is essential to make sure that the entire project is handled correctly.
Now, Jill, what about trends that you're seeing? When you began, you said that, who's involved in EB-5 at this point has really changed. And I really agree with you. The market has contracted in terms of people involved. Some smaller players went away because of costs. Some larger players decided it was a lot of paperwork and they didn't need the financing. And we see sort of a contraction of the market. So how do you see that it's changed? Give us your thoughts.
Yeah, definitely more sophistication. What we're seeing are more institutional grade projects, and we're seeing a push towards creating projects that fit with set-aside visas. We know that immigrants are getting their petitions processed much more quickly if they're in a set-aside category, and there's some available that wouldn't be caught up in retrogression. So for people specifically in mainland China, and sometimes in India, who may have applied for a visa years ago, they could still be waiting. But if they were to reapply under today's rules, under a set-aside category, they could get their visas much more quickly. So I'd say the projects are getting more mature. They're geared towards the set-aside categories. And really gone are the days of one size fits all in any service provider, but specifically for fund administration. It used to be that we could sell it as a package and everybody needed all of the same things. It's not that way anymore because, as I said, with institutional grade players, a lot of these things are built out internally. They have a finance department, they have a compliance department. And so we really don't want to force someone to duplicate efforts. We look at breaking apart these solutions that a fund administrator can provide and really focusing on the ones where Congress or USCIS are looking for a third party, an independent group to be looking over them. So if someone uses their own internal bookkeeping, we're not going to double do that effort, but we will be doing the co-signatory because that can't be done internally.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming today, for sharing your thoughts. I think this concept only serves to enhance the EB-5 program to give investors more security. And I think a lot of the provisions of the RIA really were welcome in the industry, by foreign investors to increase confidence in the program. And I think you're sort of at the forefront of that, and it's appreciated.
Well, thank you so much for having me today, Kate. It's been an honor. And if I could deliver one message to anyone listening to this podcast, it's that we've got to do all the right things to make sure that this program can be made permanent. It really does good things for the country, and we can't lose sight of that.
That's true. And right now we're valid through September 30th, 2027. And then the program is up for renewal. And I think one of, the major questions I've gotten post-election is how is the Trump presidency and a Republican Congress going to treat the program? And I'm optimistic, to be honest with you. I think this is one of the programs that, as you said, really contribute to the economy, that bring the best, the brightest entrepreneurs, investors to the US. And I think it only really serves to benefit the country at no cost to taxpayers.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Jill.
Thanks, Kate.